that the older games are better and that the modern games just aren't quite as good, but what do they mean by that? When does modern Pokemon even begin, and when does old Pokemon end? The way I like to split modern Pokemon and classic Pokemon is right on Generation 5.
Yep, that's what I'm
Anything before
thinking.
Generation 5 is classic Pokemon, with anything post Generation 5 being modern Pokemon, while Generation 5 itself acts more like a transitional period between the two. You could also count anything from the Let's Go games on as hyper modern, since they're on the most current console in the Switch and are the easiest games to access, legally of course. I mean, I would never emulate games. But that overcomplicates things even more than we normally do on this channel. I first want to talk about the older games, why people think they're better, and what they added to the franchise, and then move on to the modern games and discuss the differences. Let's start at the top with Pokemon Red and Blue, or Green in Japan, you know what I mean. These games, along with Yellow version, were the start of Pokemon and act as the foundation, with each subsequent game building upon that. As they were the first in the series, there's nothing we can really compare them to, and while they might not have aged the best due to the lack of many quality of life features, they were still good enough to warrant Pokemon becoming what it is today, and offered a fresh new take on the monster collecting genre, which was popular in Japan but never saw much international success until Pokemon. Then Generation 2 built upon that foundation and polished it while also adding new features that would be staples in Pokemon. First, we have held items, which have a huge effect on Pokemon battling, and breeding, which adds a brand new element to raising Pokemon. I'm also going to be a bit biased here and say that the best thing Generation 2 added to Pokemon was the addition of shiny Pokemon, and let's do a quick shiny Cynical reset in honor of that. You know, the day that I actually get a shiny on video while doing a race like this will be the best shiny reaction ever. There's Cyndaquil. Is it shiny? No shiny. Kind of expected that. Generation 2 also added the post-game, so to say, as the post-game Generation 1 was just catching Mewtwo, and that's basically it. Generation 2 added a condensed version of the Cancer region you can complete in a fraction of the time it would take you to complete the Johto part of the game, which was a pretty nice bonus. Post-games would remain a staple in future Pokemon games, although they weren't always well-liked. Overall, though, Generation 2 was a very welcome addition to Generation 1, just further expanding upon the world of Pokemon. Generation 3, in my opinion, is where most changes were added in terms of core mechanics, and things start to feel more modern. I like to compare Generation 3 to Generation 1 and Generation 4 to Generation 2 because they built upon the previous games in a unique way without completely overhauling things like Generation 3 data from Generation 2. The Generation 3 games don't feel nearly as dated as the first two generations do, largely due to the graphical enhancements and the quality of life features. You can have more bag storage, navigating through your PC boxes is much easier, you can run now, and the games start to focus more on a story with the evil team and the world's lore being connected with the legendary Pokemon. In the past, with Team Rocket, they did have ties to Mewtwo, but Mewtwo was kept more of a secret, while in Generation 2 there was no relation to Ho and Lugia, and then with Generation 3, the evil team started to be more directly associated with the made legendary Pokemon, in this case, Groudon and Kyogre. This is where the story became more pivotal in Pokemon, as in the past, the main goal was just to become the champion and catch them all, but Generation 3 is where that focus began to shift, with one of the main goals now being to save the world from an evil organization who wants to do more than just make a ton of money like Team Rocket did in the past. As for mechanics, the big one is the addition of abilities, which much like held items had a huge impact on Pokemon battling, and on top of that they expanded upon the held item mechanics, adding more items and building upon and perfecting the berry mechanic introduced in Generation 2. There's also Double Battles, which is a battle format used in the official VGC tournament, so I guess you could say it was a pretty monumental addition as well. Now, you guys know I love Generation 3, and pretty much every video I make ties back to Generation 3 somehow, but let's move on to Generation 4. For core mechanics, we saw the physical and special split of moves, where now each individual damaging move is categorized as either physical moves or special moves, rather than, say, all water-type moves being special moves or all ghost-type moves being physical moves like it was for the first generation. This helped encourage type diversity, since now special attacking ghost-type Pokemon like Gengar could use ghost-type moves more effectively, and physically attacking water-type Pokemon like Gyarados could use their water-type moves more effectively. Generation 4 really fleshed out the Pokemon formula, and it only took 10 years. This cycle of Pokemon, or the classic cycle as we're calling it, really focused on perfecting the game's formula, which was a big reason why many people consider the older games to be better. A lot of the additions post-Generation 4 seem like they were just added for the sake of adding something new, rather than fixing an existing problem like the physical and special split, or adding something like abilities or held items, which both became core elements in the main series game and still exist in the games today, unless you look at the Let's Go games, but that's a bit of an outlier. This leads us to the transitional period of Generation 5. Like the previous two generations, Generation 5 has a focus on the evil team tying more into the lore and legendary Pokemon. It builds upon previous mechanics like breeding, shiny hunting, and the story, and held items, but doesn't really add anything new, at least nothing that's stuck, and I'm looking at you, Triple Battles. Generation 5 is more of a culmination of what they learned through making the first 4 generations of Pokemon and what makes them great and what makes a great Pokemon game, but it didn't add anything new, which is why people call Pokemon Black and White stale upon release. It's not a bad game by any means, but I think many fans have come around Generation 5 years after its release and consider Generation 5 as a whole to be one of the better generations, same with Black and White too. That's also why I like to use it as more of a break point before we get into modern Pokemon games with Generation 6, as starting with Generation 6, things started to get a little weird, and this is where people really started to say how old Pokemon were so much better. By the time Pokemon X and Y came out, the core mechanics behind Pokemon were all figured out. Sure, they shook some things up by adding a new type of fairy, adding some more moves and items, and a lot of...
At Spectrum, we believe every day unlocks unlimited possibilities to bring you closer to the people.
A lot of quality of life enhancements, especially when it comes to getting a competitive team, but nothing entirely new was added, at least nothing entirely new that would stick. Generation 6 is where we saw a focus on each generation having some sort of battle gimmick tying into the story, with Generation 6's big battle gimmick being Mega Evolution. This was a fantastic way to give some older Pokemon some more love, although a lot didn't need it, while also adding new Pokemon without actually adding new Pokemon. We would see that later with regional forms as well, which is just another way of adding new Pokemon without adding new Pokemon. And as cool as Mega Pokemon were, they were cast aside in Generation 7 and then never returned again, at least until Legends ZA, since it looks like they will be back in that game. Then in Generation 7, we had Z-moves, which were powerful once per battle moves a Pokemon could use if it had a corresponding Mega Stone. Generation 8 had Dynamaxing or Gigantamaxing, where Pokemon got really big and sometimes changed form and was a lot stronger for 3 turns. Then in Generation 9, we had Terastallization, where Pokemon could put on a hat and change their typing and look all crystal-like. All of these gimmicks are cool, but I think a big underlying factor why people often say the older games are better is that the newer games just don't add as much, and each new iteration of Pokemon doesn't feel as impactful to the series as the first 4 generations do to the previous games before them. That's not to say that all newer games are bad though, but seriously, what have they added new since Generation 4 that can be seen as a core mechanic now? Everything they've added since just improves upon something that already exists, rather than something that drastically changes how we play Pokemon. The 3DS era in general was also when Pokemon started to get a lot easier. In X and Y, the gym leaders only have 3 Pokemon, the EXP shirt gives you a lot of extra EXP, Team Flare is a pushover, and there isn't one standout difficult battle I can think of in Generation 6. Even the championship battle in X and Y wasn't too difficult, which is a shame since the previous 2 generations had the most iconic champion fights in all of Pokemon. Then for Generation 7, things became a bit too hand-holding, with someone stopping to tell you what to do and exactly where to go every 5 minutes. The routes and areas were far more linear than in previous games, and there really wasn't too much to explore. They also experimented with island trials over gyms, which was a pretty cool change and a big change nonetheless, and added more tasks to beat the game aside from just battling, but that was short-lived, as with Generation 8 they returned to the traditional gym formula. I personally prefer the gym formula over the island trial formula anyway, and Generation 8 did dial back on the hand-holding a little bit, and make the routes a bit more explorable, but still feel very linear compared to the first 4 generations of Pokemon routes. Here's what routes in Generation 7 and Generation 8 look like. Pretty narrow and not too much to explore, then compare that to these routes in Generation 3 and Generation 4. I am cherry-picking a bit here for sure, but one thing that really added to the older games was the openness and the focus on exploration. I remember being a kid and discovering these optional areas like the Berry Master's house in Generation 3 for the first time, or the Trophy Garden in Diamond and Pearl for the first time, just to have most of that removed by Generation 8. I will give Generation 7 a bit more credit though, as there are a bit more optional areas that open up in the post-game, but having a more explorable region made the world feel more lived in, as now you can't even enter most buildings anymore. Generation 7 also does have many extra side missions you can do throughout the game or in the post-game, and I definitely have to replay Sun and Moon pretty soon again, so I'll make a video focusing more on them, as I do often say they're my least favorite games, and a lot of people tend to disagree with me on that. I haven't talked too much about the Switch games, which are the most modern Pokemon games, so let's start with that. The Let's Go games are mostly remakes of Yellow version, and while they change around the catching mechanics and then remove held items and abilities, they're still fine. I mean, it's a Generation 1 remake, and I'd still prefer to play Fire Red and Leaf Green over the Let's Go games, but they're still okay, and graphically, they're the best on the system. Then there's Sword and Shield, which felt a bit shorter than some of the previous games, and don't really add too much new. Then after Sword and Shield, we saw Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, which were remakes of Diamond and Pearl, and we'll make a video on remakes soon, so don't worry. But it's hard to fault them for much in the context of this video, since just like the Let's Go games, they're just remakes after all. And we're just mainly focusing on new editions, and I guess Let's Go isn't technically a new edition, but it was the first game on the Switch. Let's Go is just a weird game overall. Then we get to Pokemon Legends Arceus, which is sort of a remake, but not really. It's kind of a Generation 4 prequel, and it's a main series game, kind of, but the battling system is way different, and the catchy system is more realistic and pretty cool. It's a weird game, and it was the most different game we've seen and an outlier in modern games because they were mainly well received and don't have as much graphical issues as Sword and Shield or Scarlet and Violet. This was also the beginning of them making Pokemon more open world, which will continue with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet and could possibly be further built upon in future games to fundamentally change Pokemon the most it's changed in a very long time. Then there's Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and look, they tried their best here, and I think everyone agrees that these games had the potential to be the best in the series, but they fell very short due to graphical limitations and possibly time constraints. That's not to say that modern Pokemon games are all bad, though. They still have some good to them, and while I'd agree that the older games are mostly better as a whole, and the first 5 generations are just about everything that came after them, the newer games are still good in their own right, even new Pokemon Sun and Moon, despite being my least favorite in the franchise. Let's go back to X and Y with Generation 6. Many of you might not remember, but Generation 6 felt like a resurgence in Pokemon. I've been a fan of Pokemon since Generation 1, and with Generation 3 it felt like Pokemon slowed down a lot, with Generation 5 being an all-time low point just for things to pick right back up again in Generation 6, and to only expand from then until now. My favorite thing about Generation 6 is, you guessed it, the shiny hunting because of all the different shiny hunting methods that exist in that generation. While the game itself, in terms of the main story, is far from being the best, all the extra stuff is a ton of fun. Breeding and getting a competitive team is way easier than it's been before, and since starting a shiny badge quest in 4 different generations now, the one I have in Alpha Sapphire is my favorite by far. I know Alpha Sapphire isn't X and Y, but the core shiny hunting mechanics and extra stuff to do is basically the same anyway. Generation 7 has a lot of extra missions we talked about earlier, and despite the linear nature of the game, they did do their best to build up the world and make it feel more lived in. I also really appreciate how they tried something new with Island Trials over gyms, even though I personally prefer gyms. And this was the first time we saw different forms from Alolan forms, which I think are really cool. It's something we saw in every generation since. The newer games have more of a focus on improving the quality of life as a player, making things that were previously tedious much easier, which is seen.
Please give me the strength to finish this book.
Would you give the jury
more in the Switch games, more specifically the new entry Switch games like Sword and Shield and Scarlet and Violet. These 2 generations also saw a boost in online events, which is great, although it's a shame that these events only apply when the games are current, as somebody playing Scarlet and Violet 10 years from now won't be able to access most of these events. The main point I'm trying to make is the first 4 generations built up Pokemon. Generation 5 was a celebration of those first 4 generations, and since then the formula has remained largely the same, just with some gimmick temporarily added to make it feel fresh. Sometimes that works, and sometimes that doesn't, but I guess when a series goes on as long as Pokemon has, it's hard to add new core things when they already figured it out by 2010. The older games weren't perfect either, even if a lot of us, myself included, look back at them with rose-tinted glasses. I won't dwell on this too much, as I have a whole separate video on this, but basically Generation 1 is, well, a bit of a mess. Generation 2 fixes a lot of that mess but has its own issues with level gaps. Generation 3 was a soft reboot that held back a bit too much of the older Pokemon being in the actual games. Generation 4 ran rather poorly and they're pretty slow. Look, they're not perfect either.
Okay.
And the newer games aren't all bad either. Let's Go was great at converting over old players or Pokemon Go players to Pokemon in a more approachable way. Sword and Shield saw many quality of life improvements and act as a framework for where Pokemon is trying to go. Legends Arceus showed that Pokemon can be much more than just what we know, and we can have a more open world. Scarlet and Violet showed more of that open world than what it could be in the future, or at least try to, and while they all could be better and are generally worse than the older games, there's still a lot to like. Not for you, apparently. I'm not allowed to talk about you. So are modern Pokemon games really that bad? It's tough to give a definitive answer, and while the older games are better, I wouldn't just go out and say that all the new stuff is bad. I mean, sure, my channel is dominated by me playing the older games or remakes of the older games, and I definitely prefer the older games while my Switch just collects dust most of the time, although I did turn on recently to play the new Mario Party, and it's pretty fun. And while they might not be what they used to be, I can still enjoy them for what they are and appreciate
Force
them
yourself
for
to
what
play
they're
them.
trying to do. I also think it's no secret that they have a lot less time to work on these newer games, which is a big reason why they don't feel as impactful as the first four generations. So what do you guys think about modern Pokemon games versus the older Pokemon games? I can see the comments on this video being rather interesting, so let's try to keep it civil. Also consider leaving a like and subscribing if you enjoy the content, or just don't. I don't know. With all that out of the way though, thank you so much for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your